In the extraordinary form of the Roman Rite, we receive communion kneeling, assuming we can kneel, and on the tongue. In the ordinary form, as we all know, most people receive communion standing up and in the hand, although you can kneel and you can receive on the tongue. The reception on the tongue is a very ancient practice. We read about it in the writings of St. Ephrem the Syriac, who died in the year 373. But it wasn't universal in ancient times. Reception on the tongue was in fact mandated in the West by the Council of Rouen in the year 878. Similarly, kneeling, we read about people kneeling for communion from the 6th century in the West, but again it wasn't universal. In both cases, the current practice of the extraordinary form took many centuries to develop. As Pius XII expressed it in his great encyclical Mediator Dei, we shouldn't necessarily prefer things which were done in the ancient church to those which have developed over time under providence to meet the needs of the faithful. In the case of receiving on the tongue, the concern which this addresses is for the fragments of the Blessed Sacrament which might be lost. And we find in St. Cyril of Jerusalem, who of course talks about receiving communion in the hand, he says that the fragments of the Blessed Sacrament are more precious than gold dust. So there's this enormous concern with the possibility of losing any of the fragments. If you have that kind of concern, there's a difficulty with receiving in the hand. And the way they addressed that at the time was to have a number of ritual washings of the hands, before and after. This response, which was a very serious-minded one, was nevertheless not the ideal. Reception on the tongue deals with all those sorts of problems in a very practical and straightforward way. In the case of kneeling, we find when people did not kneel for communion, they made one of a number of different possible acts of reverence before they got to. The liturgical scholar Joseph Jungmann talks about people performing a triple bow, people genuflecting, people going up to communion barefoot, people kissing the foot of the priest before receiving communion. But the form in which we do it today developed over time because, in fact, kneeling for communion is in many ways more practical than doing all the things I've just mentioned. Kneeling is the key act of reverence that we understand in our culture. And indeed, this goes right back to the time of the New Testament. You have people kneeling before our Lord. But as time has gone on, kneeling has become more and more associated with the proper attitude in response to the presence of the divinity. Martin Moserbach expresses the situation in this way. If people who have been kneeling for 1,000 years suddenly get to their feet, they do not think, we're doing this like the early Christians who stood for the consecration. They are not aware of returning to some particularly authentic form of worship. They simply get up, brush the dust from their trouser legs and say to themselves, so it wasn't such a serious business after all.